Hey everyone, it's Ed. I keep meeting people in the climate and energy space who discover energy versus climate and say, where have you been all my life? So we're wondering if you could do us a favor. Mention EVC to the other energy and climate nerds you know and encourage them to check it out. We've had a strong season with great topics and guests, and would love for more people to discover the pod. Every word-of-mouth recommendation, social media post, and podcast review helps. As always, thanks for listening. We couldn't do it without you.
I think we saw some of the pitfalls of sort of raw price exposure in Winter Storm Uri, and there were a couple of retailers who had full price exposure, and all of a sudden their customers were met with incredibly high bills and led to a bit of a catastrophic problem.
Hi, I'm Ed Whittingham, and you're listening to Energy versus Climate, the show where my co-host David Keith, Sara Hastings-Simon, and I debate today's climate and energy challenges. Recently, during the heat wave that roasted the UK, one utility paid out to its customers over £100,000 to turn things down for a few hours. Not through some brand new infrastructure, just a text message and a price signal. That company is Octopus Energy, and our guest today is Eric Davids, Strategy Manager for Octopus's US arm. We talk about what it actually takes to get people to shift their electricity use, how that compares to Alberta's much blunter, please conserve grid alerts, and what happens when you hand consumers real price exposure and it goes wrong. No David for this one, it's just myself and Sara. And as you know, we rarely have folks from the private sector on the pod. In this case, we're making an exception because we wanted to find out more about Octopus and its model. So, without further ado, here's the show. Eric Davids, welcome to Energy versus Climate.
Thanks, Ed. Thanks, Sara. Glad to be aboard.
Well, we're glad to have you here. So, you are the strategy manager for Octopus Energy Group. And so, would love, maybe right off the top, if you could provide just a little bit of background on yourself, how you came to be the strategy manager for Octopus Energy Group, but then we'd love the ABC 1, 2, 3 on Octopus itself.
Yeah, absolutely. So I actually started my career in the Marine Corps. And when I was thinking about transitioning out of the Corps, I was thinking about what industry I wanted to move into. And energy just struck me as a place where I could continue mission-oriented work with sort of a collaborative space, and just really sort of drew me in. And I joined a company called Uplight, which provided utility customer engagement, demand-side management services in North America for my first 5 years. And then about a year and a half ago, I transitioned and joined Octopus Energy after having my eye on them for a long time. And Octopus, frankly, it's a pretty beautiful company. It started in 2016, and the original sort of founding intent was that the founders believed there was an ability to reimagine how utilities interacted with their customers. And it's sort of no surprise that most people don't have great relationships with their utilities, or at least don't think of them as sort of more than a commodity provider. And Octopus wanted to reimagine that and say a utility can be fundamentally different in terms of how it serves its customers. And then over time, as sort of the system has changed and as consumers are playing a more meaningful role, which we'll get into in the conversation, Octopus had a recognition that by creating a really strong relationship with their customers, they are better positioned to maximize the value of customer-sided flexibility on creating a more optimally managed system. So I've been following Octopus for a little bit of time. It has a major presence in the UK and other parts of Europe and Japan. And it had a very small presence in North America when I joined. But I joined and really tried to figure out how we might grow in this market, which is very, very different than the liberalized retail markets that we had scaled in globally.
I'd love to dig into all that, but just as a bit of a side note, and it's because for 10 years in sort of the early 2000s through to the early 2010s, I helped run, it was an internship program with the Virginia Military Institute, in that we would get VMI cadets up to where I live in the Canadian Rockies, place them locally, sometimes local government, local businesses, NGOs, have them do research writing internships, and then go back and having spent hopefully a wonderful summer in Banff and having had their horizons broadened. So for someone coming out of the Naval Academy and the Marines, how has that experience informed what you're doing now?
Totally. I think there's an element of sort of mission focus that I mentioned, and that's what drew me in. I think there's also, when I was in the Marine Corps, so much of the military is sort of revolves around energy. And I had a sniper platoon, and the limitation of the time I could keep my team out in the field was the lifespan of the batteries and how much batteries they could carry on their backs. I think it's very well known that a lot of American deaths from the previous conflicts have been sort of caused in IEDs and convoys, and many of those being fuel convoys. So I think there's this integral link between energy and sort of deployed operational military forces. And then clearly what we're seeing now is this sort of link between energy security and military, and sort of the intersection of how energy can play a role in determining the strategic outcome of a conflict. Even if you can have a tactical success, Iran's ability to have control of the Strait of Hormuz is clearly having a major impact on our ability to sort of free ourselves from this war of choice that we're in right now.
Yeah. And unfortunately, I do know the reality of injuries that come out from IEDs, as we had one of our BAM program graduates suffer an IED explosion in Afghanistan. But let's say that's neither here nor there for now. Tell me, how would you define demand flexibility? As that's what, Octopus Energy's business, you're in the business of demand flexibility.
Absolutely. So I when I look at it, I think there's the what, and the why, and the how. And the what is that each of us as individuals in our homes has a demand shape that our home sort of takes, and that the utility can see. And it's linked to our daily life patterns of when we wake up, when we turn our coffee makers on, when we turn our lights on, when we get home from work. And if you have an electric vehicle, you plug your electric vehicle in, when you run your washer dryer. All of the patterns of how we live creates a demand profile in the home. And the same is true for businesses. The same is true for data centers, which is a big piece of the conversation in North America. And demand flexibility is the ability to influence the shape of that demand curve in some way, shape, or form. And the reason to do that is because energy has different prices at different times of day, and it has different carbon intensities at different times of day. So the ability to shift sort of usage to places where energy might be cheaper or cleaner is powerful. And then also on really hot days, or cold days in Canada, I know a number of provinces in Canada, it's a winter peak. There's constraints in the system where there's risks of instability if demand outpaces supply. So the ability to go in and intervene and reduce demand during those sort of hot days or really cold days can be significant too.
Yeah, maybe. Sir, because it's timely in a practical application. We're just chatting with your colleague Grace, who's in London. She has a fan running in the background because it's so hot. So, England has been, and much of Europe has been going through this really prolonged heat wave. So what specifically is Octopus doing, say, to help reduce the pressure on the grid during the present heat wave?
Octopus integrates its flexibility into its customer-centric retail program. And as I mentioned at the outset, we focus first and foremost on developing a strong relationship with the end customer. And then what we've done on top of that is roll on innovative tariff and sort of incentive remuneration structures for end customers. So in the heat wave, for instance, one of the things that we did was we had saving sessions where we sent a small notification out to customers to say, hey, if you turn down your electricity during this period, you will be credited for sort of the savings that you delivered. And just in the past week, we were able to derive 250 megawatt hours of flexibility from customers who basically just responded to a small signal to say, hey, I'll turn down. I know there's not sort of widespread AC usage, but maybe it's shifting someone's washer dryer out of a certain period. And we paid out over 100,000 pounds to our customers by basically allowing them to participate in a very, very small way to reduce the strain on the grid during the heat wave. And I think it's just indicative of the ability to, when you have the sort of smart meters to allow for those types of programs, you have the market design that allows for a dollar to basically be distributed to an end customer for participating in a value stream that a few years ago they wouldn't have had access to. You can drive pretty meaningful participation and have a pretty meaningful effect. And that was just one example of what we did in the heat wave last week.
Got you. So you're figuring out a way to monetize, not the megawatt, but to use the phrase the negawatt. Is that right?
The negawatt. Yeah, exactly.
And maybe I'll just jump in with a comparison here. In Alberta, I'm losing track of the years, so forgive me if I've got this wrong. I think it was a year ago in the winter when we all got these text messages on our phone via various, alerts saying, please turn down your energy usage. It's been a couple times that we've gotten them. Mm-hmm. And in this case, it was really the system operator basically saying, we have an issue with having enough power available. And so we need folks to take action to, exactly as Eric was saying, maybe don't start that dishwasher or washing machine right now, something like that. And it was, the good news is it was successful and Albertans responded, but it was all based on kind of a, collective good and do your part. So the difference, one of the big differences there is it was missing that payout part. So anybody who turned down their, didn't start their dishwasher, didn't get any kind of reward for doing that. And, people that didn't do it weren't penalized, but it all relied on this, doing the right thing kind of spirit.
Totally. And what we've seen is it doesn't take a very high incentive to get someone to take an action. And obviously different communities behave differently, but even in Texas, where there's a little bit of a don't touch my thermostat type of culture, if you will, we still see pretty good adoption when we have these saving sessions there. And even if the incentive is $1 to $2 to $3, if we're able to communicate really crisply to end customers, we see pretty high adoption of people who are able to say, "Hey, yep, I'll do that," both for a small benefit, but also for the community good.
Yeah, so when you say a few bucks, I'm actually surprised to see that people would be moved by that, because I've often thought that we've had the technology to talk to our dishwashers, to talk even to our fridges, thermostats for a while, but at the household level, people seem, it's a whiz bang thing. And look, I can turn my temperature through my smartphone when I'm away from my home. But very few people are actually using it to save money in any kind of way. Now, if the utility takes that over for them and makes it a little bit thoughtless, then people are much more inclined. But you'd mentioned, if you communicate with the end customer in an effective way, you can help them to see the light, of a savings of a few bucks. So you've obviously, you said off the top, you've figured out how to do that in the UK, other parts of Europe, even Japan, but you say you've got a very small base in the US. So that for a lack of trying to date, or is that for a lack of effectiveness? Or is that there are some other barriers in place for the American end user that aren't in place for European ones?
Yeah. Well, maybe I'll start by sharing sort of Octopus's approach to flexibility and what's worked in the UK particularly quite well, and then move into sort of what of that can translate to the US and what of that we have trouble translating. And one of the sort of things that I think about when I think about flexibility is someone who has an energy bill, and they might have an EV, they might have the thermostat. For that person, all of these things are related to their energy. However, in the US right now, someone pays their energy bill to their regulated utility. They might receive a incentive for being part of a thermostat demand response program. And they might have a separate program where they have their EV enrolled in a managed charging program and they receive a gift card every year for being part of that program. I think what Octopus has been able to do brilliantly in the UK, and a lot of it's around market design, but a lot of it's around the thought that went into the customer value proposition development, was integrating all of these into a single customer decision where Octopus is able to sell an outcome to a customer and to say, do you want 50% charging at night or 70% off your charging at night compared to what it would be sort of in a normal tariff structure? And a customer says, yeah, that sounds great. I'd love to have 70% off my EV charging or free EV charging at night. And then that person is enrolled in the Octopus EV tariff. And then over the course of the night, when the person comes home, they plug their EV in, Octopus is able to determine when that vehicle charges and when it's not charging. And then there's an outcome where in the morning, when the person goes off to work and take their charger out, we ensure that the vehicle reaches the set point that the user or the owner had established previously. And I think it's selling that outcome that's integrated into the energy plan, where then when the customer receives their energy bill, they see a credit of for all of your EV costs, they were discounted by 70% off what they were sort of in normal hours. And we take all of the complexity around sort of trading the flexibility of that asset away from the end customer. And they're just sold an outcome that is, frankly, is too good to refuse. It's like, that's a great deal. And then we sort of articulate it in a way that is very consumer friendly and integrally linked to the energy plan.
Sorry, Sara, it would be useful, maybe if you could explain it using the Canadian context or maybe specifically the Alberta context. Because as in our province here, Eric, we don't have any time of day incentives for when we charge. So Sara and I both have EVs, whether we charge it in the middle of the day, during peak hours, middle of the night, there's zero difference in the price and therefore zero incentive. So what do? Is you come back and you're getting in at supper hour, you're doing what everyone else is doing, just charging it right away because you're there. That's when you think of it. But there is an incentive for the utility itself based on the pool price. And Sara, maybe you could explain the mechanics of that, because what happens behind the switch is still a bit of a mystery for a lot of consumers.
Yeah, I think we're sort of like in between this, kind of utopia that Eric describes, where you have kind of someone managing this all for you, and the world where you have none of it being done, in the sense that the way that consumers in Alberta see pricing, as you say, Ed, we don't get a price, we don't get charge different amounts for electricity at different times of the day when you use it. But the way that electricity is generated and sold on the market as a whole within the province does have this variation down to right now the hourly level. So what that means is that every hour the system operator is essentially making the markets come together and clear. And so there's a certain amount of electricity that's needed, and different generators offer to sell that electricity at different prices. And then you essentially, you get a clearing price where the supply and demand meet. And that is the hourly price for power in the market. And that price can vary actually wildly, right? So there are, and in fact, in Alberta, where we have an increasing amount, as many places, increasing amount of renewables, we also have a very large cogeneration base. There are an increasing number of hours where the price of power is actually zero. So it's kind of almost, I think, sounds unbelievable when you tell people, like, how could that possibly be the case? But there are an increasing number of hours where it is free to purchase power in Alberta. And then you have the other side, at the other end, where you have, hours where it costs, $1,000 per megawatt hour to buy power. And what you and I see as a consumer at the end of the day, at the end of the month, I should say, is an average over this sort of average shape. So there's a kind of shape defined for the average profile of residential electricity use in the province of Alberta. And we see a price that is, somehow related to the weighted average across those hours. And I say somehow because then, moreover, right now we do have a competitive retail market in Alberta. So that's why if you live in Alberta, you get all these like cards in the mail, switch to so-and-so energy and you'll get this much savings. But the offers are relatively limited. So right now you have the offer of having a so-called floating rate. So you basically end up paying, that average market price, or you can have a fixed rate, which is a company is going to offer you a guarantee based on their forward projections. So you get some, security there. So that's there's a little bit of choice there. By the way, if you follow Blake Schaefer on X or Blue Sky, he often tells people when it makes sense to switch from one to the other. So there's a little plug for my electricity center co-director with his trading experience. But that's about it. There's no ability, given what I just told you, that there's these hours where power is free. Of course, it would be great if, you and I could charge our EVs then, or we could start our dishwashers then and, not charge our EVs when it costs $1,000 an hour. And that's where Octopus and this kind of demand flexibility type of offerings comes in that we don't yet have to date in Alberta.
Yeah, it's interesting. And I'm not an expert in Alberta, but I do wonder, a lot of the dynamics are pretty similar to Texas and fairly similar to the UK in competitive retail and advanced metering. I forget, what is the penetration of advanced metering in Alberta? Do you Do you know off the top of your head?
I don't know. I always forget the number because in Calgary, it's basically zero. So in my very provincial mind, it's zero. Of course, in Edmonton, there's a lot more. So it is, close to 50% or something, but we don't yet have the ability to, regulate on a regulatory level to look at the hourly power use and use that to do billing in Alberta.
Yeah. Because in the UK, what we kind of saw is after half-hourly settlement existed, after there was deep smart meter penetration and the combination of sort of innovative retail, you were able to start to create these offers that, again, they were offers that were too good for customers to refuse. And that's what sort of turbocharged flexibility in the UK and really beyond sort of the levels of penetration that we've seen across North America, because it's just sort of fundamentally a different customer value proposition. But it was sort of those were the fundamental factors that were necessary to be in place first. And it sounds like Alberta, similar to maybe Texas, and Texas might be a little bit more advanced, but it's on its way. It's just it just sort of, there's a little bit of like preconditions to creating sort of the type of business model and type of customer offers that Octopus has been able to do in the UK.
Oh, and just to follow up on that, I would say the key thing is that, and maybe just to explain for the listeners, this hourly piece. So if you go look at your electricity meter, it'll have, a sort of dumb meter has this little spinning circle, or maybe it even has a digital readout, but it's not looking at that power use within an hour. It's really just like the total counting up. And so obviously, if we're talking about being able to, use power in the hour when it's cheap and not use it when it's expensive, you need that ability to know how much power you're actually using in that one specific hour. So you have some infrastructure constraints that you need to unlock this in a place like Alberta as well as others. And then you have the ability, the rules that the regulator sets that says, you are allowed to make an offering to a consumer that has this kind of structure to it, where you're letting them pay less at some hours versus others. It's sort of which I think it's fair, and Ed, not to take over, but maybe we can talk a little bit about that next. Is like, okay, so why not just throw the regulations down? Just let companies do whatever they want to do. And so maybe Eric, you could talk a little bit about it. I think there's been examples of some utilities that have tried to do that, where it's like, well, we'll give you full exposure to hourly pricing, and that sounds really great when you get to pay the zeros, but sometimes that can go really wrong. So what are the guardrails in place, or how does this get approached in a way that accesses those savings, but doesn't leave someone, oh my God, I need to charge my EV and it costs $1,000 for this hour. I've now lost, all my savings.
I think we saw some of the pitfalls of sort of raw price exposure in Winter Storm Uri, and there were a couple of retailers who had full price exposure, and all of a sudden their customers were met with incredibly high bills and led to a bit of a catastrophic problem. So I think we have sort of tended to be on the sort of the retailer, the utility, if you will, is better positioned to take risk than the individual end customer, and to sort of aggregate that risk across individuals. So I think what we have tried to do is to create a system where customers have the ability to participate in these new value streams. They also always retain control of the devices in their homes. For instance, in our electric vehicle product, when someone plugs their electric vehicle in, and we have our algorithm of saying that won't charge until midnight, but if that person needs it charged earlier for one reason or the other, they can press I forget the terminology. This is in our UK product, but it's some boost. It's a boost charge, and they can basically have it charged automatically. The same is true for thermostats. If there's a demand response program where there's a sort of a turn down or turn up of thermostats, but someone has an elderly person visiting their home, there's always the ability to override that sort of turn down signal from the utility. I think what we've seen, though, across both EVs and thermostats is that on average, the amount of people, if you sort of execute your algorithms effectively, you execute your communications effectively, the amount of people who opt out is between 2 and 3% of these programs. So it's indicative of, done right, generally you get pretty good participation. And then you also aren't sort of passing on a ton of the risk, the market risk to the end customer who's just not positioned to take that risk or think about it. And it's just not part of their mind share. So it's better to create something relatively simple and easy to understand and sort of not necessarily make them have to be checking half-hourly energy prices throughout their workday.
You talked about preconditions that need to exist for, a successful market entry for Octopus Energy. And I'd imagine, so one I don't know about and have a question. The other, maybe it'd be clear, like you'd need to have some sense of how meaningful the opportunity is. And that is based on the overall load. Is consumer demand a significant part of the portion, or is it an insignificant part of the portion relative to industrial and commercial demand? And then the second one I'd love to hear about is microgeneration. Are you more likely to enter a market that has a significant number of microgenerating consumers, or does that not factor in?
That's a good question. I mean, I'd say we're at this inflection point as Octopus Energy Group where most of our market entry has been in places where we've gone in as a liberalized retailer. So we have a large business in the UK, obviously. We have large businesses in Spain, France, Germany, Italy, and Japan. And when I joined Octopus a year and a half ago, we had a business in Texas as well, a retail business. And I think our sort of next horizon is saying, where can we enter in support of regulated utilities where an end customer, so sort of I think everyone in Canada except for Alberta, doesn't get to pick who they get their energy from. And I think in those instances, the question is customer service a priority? Is there an incentive and a desire for the utility to be more customer-centric in its approach to end customers? Because some utilities, there's actually no incentive to be more customer-centric. And then secondly, is flexibility a regulatory requirement or is it a strategic imperative? And a lot of sort of thermostat demand response programs in the US, sort of when I first came out of the Marine Corps and joined the industry, were, I'd say, more of regulatory requirements. And it was smaller, and this industry has evolved quite quickly. But it was more of saying, hey, we need to have 10,000 thermostats in this demand response program, but that's not going to be at all sort of integrated into our planning or our operations. Octopus is interested in entering is utilities who are starting to view flexibility as a key value driver in this sort of new era where a lot of renewables are coming online, and particularly a way to unlock value for end customers. And Octopus sort of has this theory that the energy transition, it must be good for the end customer. It must sort of have ways of tangibly bringing down prices. Electrotech must be better than fossil fuel alternatives. And sort of we are bullishly on the side of sort of advancing strategies aligned to those sort of those missions, if you will. And to your point about sort of microgeneration, I think it's really interesting and to try to figure out sort of are there areas where we can sort of better maximally use sort of prosumer activity, and whether that's sort of having a whole fleet of solar and saying, could we add batteries to that fleet? And could that create sort of more optimal system effects? I think there's a lot around sort of balcony solar and sort of small micro batteries that we're exploring right now. And really, what it comes down to, maybe to put a period on it, is it's trying to find ways to empower end consumers to save money and take part in value streams that previously were unavailable to them. And where we can do that, I think we're keen to dig in.
Just picking up on what you were saying there about kind of, well, two questions in one. One is like, how would you explain why now is different, right? Because I think to be critical, one could say, okay, we've heard about this like prosumer and consumer involvement and all these things. And, there is a little bit of a hype cycle, like did it really deliver? Why is now different? And then maybe in addition to that, in cases where you are working with consumers sort of at large scale, how does it, you mentioned like a changing relationship with the utility. Do you think it changes their relationship with energy as well, too? Or is it so hands off that it's kind of still like outside of their, it doesn't quite change the way they think about energy, I guess, is that a question for you.
To your first question, and I mean, these themes are well documented on your show too, but I think the story of demand growth, the sort of imperative of affordability and how that's sort of a top ballot election issue in a lot of US states right now. And then also just sort of it's a what got us here isn't going to get us there moment. I think in the sort of U.S. utility industry and continuing to sort of have a sort of capex heavy business model and not necessarily focus on utilization is going to continue to lead to higher rates, which is increasingly untenable. So how do we sort of get out of this spiral that we're in and think differently? And I said the word utilization. I think a lot of it's around how do you better utilize the resources you have today. And sort of as one sort of specific example in there too, that sort of is thematically aligned to what I just said. I think a lot of this data center load growth, I mean, it's well documented too, that it's being slowed down by communities that are pushing back and saying, hey, I don't want that in my community. I think it might raise electricity rates. And I think there's a lot of perception about that. And is there a way to sort of use this inflection point in the U.S. energy system, which is in a fundamentally different place than it was a couple of years ago, to say, hey, let's accelerate the deployment of electrified technology into homes. Let's optimize those assets in new ways. And a lot of this is around batteries too. And I think VJ in the podcast a couple of weeks ago was talking about battery costs declining so rapidly and fundamentally. Like, could you pair sort of all of these trends together to create a lot more electrified tech in homes, have these optimized in such a way that increases system utilization and ultimately brings down costs for end customers? I think that's kind of the moment that we're in, and we see sort of consumers as a part of the solution in a way that a few years ago, I think it was sort of you're paying a bill and you're sort of more of a taker than a participant. And maybe that gets to your second question. I think it's how will sort of your and my relationship with electricity change over the next 5 to 10 years? I think it's going to be interesting to see, can utilities provide the type of customer-centric value propositions that Octopus is able to do in the UK and other markets globally. And Octopus has had a lot of enabling factors to enable that type of relationship with an end customer. But let me just give an example of my home utility, where I get a home energy report every month that says you use this much energy in comparison to your neighbor. Unfortunately, it's higher than my neighbor, but that report doesn't acknowledge that I have an electric vehicle and I'm participating in that electric vehicle in a separate utility EV managed charging program. And separately, there's a smart thermostat program, which I can participate in, but that's again communicated in a separate channel to me. And I think is there a way to essentially sort of say, hey, we've had a lot of learnings about the value of demand flexibility. We've had a lot of proof points, and a lot of these programs are quite scaled, but to sort of bring all those together so that when a utility interacts with an end customer, they're able to share sort of a more coherent customer experience of saying, hey, you've used this much energy last month. Here's what you've used it on. Here are a couple of ways that you have eligible to you to save money. That might be switching onto a time of use rate or participating in a home energy efficiency program. And then here are a few ways to participate in new value streams that previously might have not been available to you. And can you provide that customer-centric sort of interface that allows for someone to fundamentally start to view their utility differently and to have these programs that utility has and has proven in a more streamlined way? And I think that's where we hope to get to. And I think the question is, does the utility own that, or does Tesla have that type of experience for their end customers, or Renew Home have that type of an experience for their end customers? And it's a complex ecosystem. And it's sort of, I think it's sort of, where do customers' mind shares go when they think about sort of their energy management of their home?
Well, I've got an anecdote about great customer experience, but just before that, just to date stamp this recording, just today, Meta announced it's going to spend $13 billion to develop a 1 gig data center to power AI here in Sturgeon County in Alberta. Wow. Yeah, we had our premiere. We're in the midst of the Calgary Stampede and make the announcement with a nice cowboy hat on, and everyone's super excited. But the customer experience I want to refer to, and this is going back decades to the mid-90s, and when I was a student in Japan living in an international exchange student dormitory, and per room, you would need to go down to the lobby, feed 1,000 yen notes into a machine that would then buy you electricity credits that you could see next to your thermostat in your room. And so during a hot Japanese summer, if you're running the air conditioning, you could see that balance rapidly dwindling, and was this great constant visual reminder of the impact financially of you using electricity. And so much so that when the dorm room next to me came open in the summer and we were connected by the same balcony, and the sliding door was left open. And when someone left, they would just reset it to near infinity, the electricity, because no one was in there. I would sneak into the room next door, turn the air conditioning on, and sleep there so that I could use that free electricity instead of paying for my electricity in my own room, showing that people will hopelessly game the system if they're able to do so. But that does lead to a serious question. Your Octopus Energy, you said, is in Japan, and Japanese have this interesting relationship with electricity, and especially post-Fukushima. And they seem to have measures that give that direct sort of message, that direct signal more to consumers there. At the same time, it is a very Byzantine system that they have with electricity generators and retailers and whatnot. So I'd be curious to know, what specifically have you learned from your foray into the Japanese market? And are any of those lessons transferable to other jurisdictions?
You know, Ed, your anecdote was awesome to hear. I haven't worked closely with that piece of our business, so I'm not in the position to sort of share specifically like our detailed learnings from our business in Japan. It's a joint venture with Tokyo Gas, and I'm just not in a position to share sort of more deeply about that. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no problem.
As we're talking about energy transition writ large, I think there's always this thread of equity that runs through it all, right? In terms of, are the ways that we're changing our energy systems going to improve equity, maintain a system that's already not equitable, or, make things worse and make things less equitable? How does demand flexibility come in? And kind of, again, is it like, are there pitfalls to look out for? Like we talked a little bit around, that there being risks of going to a full price exposure system. Is it inherently more equitable? What's your view on that, or what needs to be done to ensure equity?
I think one of the risks as we branch out of sort of smart thermostat-based flexibility value is that just the resource types that people would have to buy to participate, electric vehicle, a battery, heat pump, are pretty expensive up front. And I think one of the focuses is on how those the upfront price of those can be brought down, leveraging the tail value of flexibility. And is there a way to have a lease for one of these assets, and maybe batteries or sort of heat pumps, which I think can be seen as a thermal battery, or maybe easier to think about in this respect than EVs. But is there a way to think about it where, as part of the financing package, you can leverage the long tail value of the flexibility to bring down the cost? So for someone, it's actually a very affordable thing to install in their home. And also there's a time of use rate, as we were talking about earlier, where by installing a battery, they are actually probably saving more money than they're paying for in the lease cost by participating in a time of use sort of arbitrage. And I think that's the type of innovation that we're leaning into, because we have a very strong view that we want sort of, again, it's green energy, good for people's bills, and it's for everyone's bills. And I think it's sort of people who are directly participating in the program by having these assets on their homes, and then ultimately it's are you bringing down the system costs too? But I think that's kind of the key is can you bring down the upfront costs, and can you sort of spread the benefits to everyone participating is the objective. Maybe the one other thing that I'll add there, Sara, is, and I don't think it's legal in Canada right now, but there's a lot of movement right now in sort of balcony solar and small batteries in homes in the US. And I think, is there a pathway to creating more opportunities for people with sort of smaller prosumer type systems to participate? And then also time of use rates, behavioral demand response. There's ways to sort of provide these value streams to people without the need for sort of big upfront costs. And I think trying to lean into those too, along with sort of bigger battery programs and whatnot.
Yeah, and if you're to go in and ask a policymaker for any of those incentives, the first question is going to be, because we're still in an affordability crisis, is this going to create increased costs for any end user, any consumer, or is this going to lower costs? And it's not enough if that, we're going to have a financing mechanism which is going to spread the pain over several months or several years. it really is, there's no appetite right now for anything that's going to increase costs. And it seems like Octopus has figured out a good way to come up with something that benefits both the climate, but also really benefits the consumer at a time when the climate isn't an afterthought, but it's certainly, lower down on the list of priorities right now in the face of this affordability crisis.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah.
Well, Eric, thanks so much. Listen, I will say on energy versus climate, it's rare that we have someone from a company come, and appear on the show. We're very careful just about there not being any kind of conflict of interest, unlike certain prominent politicians these days, like the president you have in your country and his $2.2 billion, most of that from crypto, or even, as we were talking to your colleague, Nigel Farage, who seemed to have no problem getting paid whatever it was, £5 million from a crypto investor prior to entering public life. But now, of course, he is set to face in this election as a result, Count Binface. And we'll all be watching that, and we'll be very curious to see if utility costs feature into that local election. But, while we don't take any, payment, it's not pay to play, we're certainly not opposed to getting swag. So, if there's some nice Octopus Energy mug or a hat or something like that, that doesn't breach our conflict of interest guidelines. Just want to be clear.
And I have been for years wanting one of those little octopus stuffies. So, when you were saying that we don't accept any payment, I was about to say, speak for yourself, because I'm still hoping to get my hands on one of those.
We could arrange that. Yeah. Her name is Constantine. We'll ship a couple your way. No, thanks for having me. Love what you guys do and really appreciate the conversation.
Thanks for listening to the special summer bonus edition of Energy versus Climate. Subscribe to our YouTube channel for video versions, clips, and add a comment or question while there. And if you have ideas for show topics, send them along to info@energyversusclimate.com. That's info@energyvsclimate.com. We'll be back in September with a brand new season of shows. In the meantime, keep an eye on the EBC feed. We might be dropping some more bonus content this summer. And as always, thanks for listening.